They told you warriors lived by noble honor codes and fair fights. What if I told you some could legally kill you for bad manners? From samurai who could cut you down on a bridge, to knights who spared rich enemies and butchered everyone else. From Spartans checking newborns like military equipment, to Vikings turning lawsuits into axe fights on tiny islands. These rules weren't just brutal, they were downright bizarre and petty. So how did anyone survive living under them day to day? Let's dive into 39 warrior rules that make absolutely no sense. Samurai kill, rights under Kirisute Gomen. In Edo period Japan, a samurai's bruised ego could literally cost you your life. Under Kirisute Gomen, a samurai could cut down a commoner for perceived insult. The rule sounds like a license to murder, but came wrapped in paperwork. After the killing, the samurai was supposed to report everything to magistrates. He had to prove the insult was serious enough to justify drawing steel. If witnesses contradicted him, the offended samurai could face his own punishment. Still, most commoners never risked testing where that invisible line actually was. People learned to bow deeper, speak softer, and avoid eye contact on narrow streets. The rule turned daily manners into a quiet survival game around armed elites. Knights preached chivalry, but could legally massacre peasant infantry. On paper, chivalry sounded noble. In practice, it abandoned most people on the field. Medieval codes mainly protected knights and nobles, not barefoot infantry or camp followers. Capturing an armored noble promised ransom. Slaughtering nameless foot soldiers brought no consequences. Chronicles describe battles where noble prisoners dined well, while commoners died in heaps. Even truces often applied only to men of quality, not the hired spearmen beside them. If peasants broke and ran, few knights felt honor-bound to spare their backs. The same code that preached mercy also excused burning fields and villages. For the people supplying food and bodies, chivalry mostly lived in expensive poems. It was a moral system designed by elites, conveniently centered on elite survival. Samurai forced ritual suicide for embarrassingly minor disgraces. For some samurai, the punishment for bureaucratic embarrassment was literally disembowelment. Ritual suicide, or seppuku, began as a battlefield choice to avoid capture. By the peaceful Edo era, it also became a courtroom sentence for disgraced officials. A mismanaged domain census, a botched audience, or offending the wrong superior could qualify. The condemned samurai was expected to face death calmly, sometimes composing a final poem. Witnesses treated the act like a grim performance, proving loyalty to lord and status. Families sometimes kept their stipends precisely because the relative died properly. Shogunate leaders even ordered seppuku to remove political rivals with a veneer of honor. A ritual supposedly about personal choice became a terrifying instrument of bureaucratic control. Church tried to ban crossbows as too unchivalrous. Medieval church councils actually tried to outlaw an early overpowered weapon of war. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council condemned crossbows and bows against Christians as hateful. The fear wasn't just piety, it was about class and battlefield hierarchy. A barely trained commoner with a crank and bolt could pierce a noble's mail. Suddenly, expensive armor and lineage couldn't guarantee survival at comfortable charging distance. The ban technically threatened excommunication, but rulers happily ignored it when convenient. Armies kept fielding crossbowmen, especially against fortified towns and stubborn enemy knights. The rule became this strange moral fig leaf over very practical battlefield technology. Chivalry tried to slow progress. War and profit pushed it straight through anyway. Knights treated captured noble enemies gently, slaughtered ordinary soldiers. On the right side of armor, losing a battle could mean a paid vacation. By the High Middle Ages, knights saw enemy nobles as walking bags of ransom. If you surrendered in good armor and fine heraldry, you were worth more alive. You might share your captor's table, send letters home, and negotiate release terms. Meanwhile, unarmored infantry often faced execution, mutilation, or quick sale into slavery. Chronicles describe fields where nobles were carefully spared while commoners lay in piles. The logic was brutal economics disguised as mutual respect between gentlemen of arms. Knights could call it mercy, while ignoring the bodies that didn't carry coats of arms. War became a business deal for the few and a graveyard for everyone else. Honorable duels forbade doctors, even when everyone expected gunshots. Some dueling codes managed to be both obsessed with fairness and allergic to safety. In early modern Europe, pistol duels were supposed to settle questions of honor, not murder. Gentlemen wrote elaborate rules on distance, number of shots, and acceptable witnesses. Yet, the same rules could forbid surgeons from rushing in until the exchange ended. The thinking went that medical help might interfere with a fair outcome. So seconds watched bleeding men on frosty fields, arguing over whether honor was satisfied. Even when everyone knew one shooter was the better shot, the ritual continued. Many duels ended with one man dead and the other legally vindicated. Honor culture turned preventable injuries into permanent graves, all to preserve appearances. Viking holmgang duels let you legally kill persistent complainers. In Viking Age Scandinavia, some arguments ended not with lawyers, but with axes on an island. Holmgang was a formal duel that doubled as a kind of traveling courtroom. If someone kept pressing a claim over land, insult, or property, you challenged them. The duel ground was marked out, sometimes on an actual small islet. Refusing a lawful challenge could mean legally losing your case without a swing. Fighting meant stepping into a space where killing became acceptable verdict, not murder. Saga writers loved describing these showdowns as both legal proceedings and blood sport. A clever or ruthless fighter could win disputes by simply outliving his opponents. Trial by combat turned stubborn plaintiffs into corpses and legal conflicts into heroic stories. Spartan mothers ordained sons to return, with your shield or on it. Few one-liners capture a city's mindset like the Spartan mother's parting advice. According to later Greek writers, mothers told sons to return with their shields or on them. The heavy hoplite shield symbolized your place in the battle line. Drop it while fleeing, and you endangered every man standing next to you. Spartan culture wrapped that practical detail in a frightening emotional expectation. Die holding the shield, and your family could grieve with pride, not shame. Survive after throwing it away, and you risked exile, ridicule, or worse. Stories tell of mothers rejecting cowards and celebrating sons who never came back. An entire education system trained boys for that one brutal pass-fail moment. Spartan system inspected newborns and could abandon weak babies. The most chilling Spartan rule might be the one about babies and cliffs. Ancient writers claimed elders inspected newborns and exposed those deemed too weak. They supposedly carried infants to a chasm near Mount Taygetus outside Sparta. If the baby looked sickly or deformed, it could be left to die. Modern archaeologists argue the reality was probably less systematic than the legend suggests. Still, Spartans cultivated this story as proof their citizens were born tough. The myth itself became part of the city's terrifying brand across Greece. Whether exaggerated or not, it told enemies and children what Sparta valued: In that worldview, physical perfection mattered more than any individual infant's life. Roman decimation, randomly executed 1 in 10, cowardly soldiers. Imagine your unit breaks in battle and punishment arrives as a deadly lottery. Roman commanders sometimes used decimation, selecting every 10th man to die by lot. The unlucky soldier wasn't just executed, his comrades did the killing. Survivors lost rations, slept outside the camp, and lived with permanent guilt. Historians debate how often decimation actually happened versus rhetorical threat in speeches. Either way, the idea alone kept soldiers terrified of collective disgrace. Cowardice stopped being an individual failure and became a shared death sentence. Men suddenly had 2 battle fears: foreign enemies and their own enraged officers. Discipline by terror turned scared humans into a more obedient, traumatized war machine. Roman generals canceled battles if sacred chickens refused breakfast. Sometimes, the fate of fleets rested on whether chickens felt like snacking. Roman commanders often consulted sacred chickens, reading victory and how they pecked grain. If the birds ate eagerly, omens were good. If not, doom loomed. One consul allegedly hurled the uncooperative chickens overboard, joking they could drink instead. He then sailed into the Battle of Drepana and suffered a crushing defeat. The story's accuracy is debated, but Romans retold it as a warning. Ignoring bad omens became almost as dangerous as ignoring enemy formations. Generals juggled tactics with religious theater, terrified of offending gods and voters. In that world, battlefield planning sometimes started with checking a divine poultry forecast. Aztec eagle warriors tried to capture enemies for sacrifice. In Aztec warfare, killing too efficiently could actually hold your career back. Elite eagle and jaguar warriors gained status by capturing enemies alive for sacrifice. Training focused on disabling opponents, grabbing hair and weapons instead of finishing blows. A warrior needed multiple live captives to qualify for the most prestigious orders. Battles sometimes looked like chaotic wrestling matches wrapped in feathers, obsidian, and war cries. Captured warriors could later die in ritual combat or at temple altars. The rule twisted incentives. Bravery meant risking your life to preserve your enemies. Aztec art and codices proudly showed these elaborately dressed captors and doomed prisoners. Promotion, religion, and politics all met on a battlefield obsessed with useful survivors. Mongol rules forbade washing in rivers during military campaigns. The Mongol Empire's law code even controlled when soldiers were allowed to wash. According to later sources on the Yasa, bathing in running water could be forbidden. One version bans washing during thunderstorms, supposedly to avoid angering water spirits. To outsiders, this looked like confirmation that Mongol camps were filthy and uncivilized. Modern historians argue the rule probably mixed spiritual taboos with practical river safety. But for ordinary warriors, it just meant days of sweat under heavy lamellar armor. You might cross pristine rivers for weeks without being allowed a proper rinse. Yet the same army perfected logistics, messaging, and battlefield discipline across continents. It's a strange combination: hyper-organized conquest wrapped around very superstitious hygiene rules. Zulu regiments were forbidden to marry until king approved. In Shaka's Zulu kingdom, the army even decided when you were allowed to start a family. Young men were grouped into age-based regiments, living together in military homesteads. They trained, drilled, and campaigned while strictly forbidden to marry without royal permission. The logic was simple. Unmarried warriors owed all their energy to the king. No wives, no children, no divided loyalties when it was time to march. Permission to marry often came only when a regiment retired from frontline service. Then, sometimes in one massive ceremony, dozens of veterans finally received marriage approval. Until that moment, a private relationship could be treated like desertion from duty. The rule turned the king into gatekeeper over both battle honors and personal happiness. Samurai elites tried to restrict firearms to protect sword status. Japan embraced guns quickly, then spent centuries trying to pretend it hadn't. Matchlock firearms arrived in the 16th century and reshaped Sengoku-era warfare overnight. Massed gunnery units suddenly mattered more than individual sword skill on horseback. Victories like Nagashino showed volleys of bullets tearing through charging cavalry lines. After unification, rulers issued weapon hunts and regulations, limiting guns among commoners. Elite samurai culture still idealized the sword as the soul of the warrior. Official stories later exaggerated how gun-free Edo society really was in practice. Behind the scenes, matchlocks never vanished. They were just tightly controlled and downplayed. The rules tried to freeze an older image of honor while quietly keeping modern firepower. Knights needed heralds to officially announce wars before attacking. In theory, many medieval wars were supposed to start with a loud, polite warning. Customs developed where heralds or messengers formally declared hostilities between rulers. This let kings claim they fought openly, not like treacherous bandits or assassins. Heralds, often protected by tradition, carried ornate coats of arms instead of armor and shields. They might read out grievances, launch a challenge, or name a formal campaign season. Ignoring such rituals could stain a ruler's reputation among other European courts. Of course, reality often ignored theory when surprise offered a better advantage. Raids, chevauchés, and sudden castle seizures still happened without any trumpet-blowing speeches. The rules survived mostly as a way to make ugly conflicts sound civilized. Samurai etiquette forbade stepping on the decorative edges of tatami. Some samurai rules made more sense for flooring than for battlefield glory. In elite Japanese homes, the cloth borders of tatami mats were carefully woven. Stepping on those borders was considered rude, careless, and possibly dangerous to your rank. In earlier eras, certain border patterns even indicated family crests or noble status. Putting your heel there risked symbolically stepping on someone's name or authority. Samurai children learned to walk the seams instinctively, gliding between mats like choreography. Guests who ignored the rule quietly marked themselves as unschooled or disrespectful. In a tightly hierarchical society, even your foot placement broadcast social awareness. Honor wasn't just about dying bravely, it was also about not scuffing the carpet. Bushido ideals forbade surrender even when ransom was possible. The cleanest version of Bushido leaves no room for raising your hands. Samurai moralists praised warriors who chose death over capture, even when ransom was negotiable. Stories celebrated last stands, self-inflicted deaths, and commanders who refused to flee burning castles. Pragmatic lords sometimes preferred surrender, but ideology pushed individuals toward dramatic ends. Later writers in the Edo period polished these tales into moral instruction. They contrasted true warriors with those who bargained for their lives or switched sides. By the 20th century, similar ideas shaped propaganda for soldiers in modern wars. The cost was enormous. Fewer chances for prisoners, truces, and negotiated survival. When surrender equals shame, the battlefield becomes a place with fewer exits. Knights considered shooting horses dishonorable, but slaughtering men acceptable. Some knightly rules cared more about cavalry animals than human rib cages. Treatises and stories often framed killing an opponent's horse as a low blow. A mounted knight without a horse lost status, mobility, and much of his equipment. Yet destroying that asset was sometimes seen as unfair rather than smart tactics. Meanwhile, stabbing the same knight through mail with a sword was perfectly honorable. The contradiction came from seeing the horse as part of elite identity. Hurting equipment felt unsporting. Hurting the noble inside was legitimate combat. Archers and infantry, less bound by these ideals, shot horses whenever necessary. Over time, gunpowder and realism chipped away at this oddly sentimental battlefield rule. Medieval tournaments were practice, yet killed knights with banned weapons. The medieval world's favorite sport regularly maimed its most glamorous celebrities. Tournaments started as chaotic melees, then gradually added rules to make them safer. Lords banned sharp lances, shortened spear tips, and limited certain kinds of blows. Yet accidents kept happening as armored men slammed into each other at speed. Wealthy knights invested fortunes in horses, armor, and pageantry, then died in rehearsals. Chroniclers list nobles crushed, impaled, or trampled during supposedly regulated events. Church councils even tried banning tournaments entirely because of the body count. Still, the prestige and social networking were too tempting for elites to quit. Practice battles proved nearly as lethal as the real thing they were meant to simulate. Samurai were forbidden to draw swords inside lords' castle corridors. In many domains, unsheathing steel indoors could end your career before any swing. Castle regulations often banned drawing swords inside corridors without explicit emergency orders. Wooden hallways, paper walls, and tightly packed retainers made sudden violence catastrophic. More importantly, steel flashing near the lord's quarters suggested rebellion, not self-defense. Domain laws threatened confiscation of swords, dismissal, or even execution for violators. Samurai therefore learned to settle grudges outside gates, not in extension passageways. Stories tell of hot-headed retainers restrained by calmer colleagues at sliding doors. The quiet scraping of a sword collar could turn every head in fear. Honor demanded bravery in battle, but strict self-control near the center of power. Samurai sumptuary laws dictated exactly which colors each rank wore. Even a kimono's shade could betray whether you were showing off illegally. Edo period sumptuary edicts restricted fabrics, patterns, and colors across social classes. Commoners were pushed toward subdued browns, grays, and indigo rather than bright silks. Samurai wardrobes, too, signaled rank, clan, and official position at a glance. A retainer turning up in flashy merchant styles risked reprimand or forced outfit changes. Officials argued that modest dress preserved social order and moral seriousness. In reality, people found creative loopholes, hiding intricate designs in lining and details. Fashion became a quiet arms race between regulators and clever dyers across Edo streets. Warrior culture policed not just swords and behavior, but the exact color of your sleeves. Crusader vows forced knights toward Jerusalem, even when wars were over. One promise in front of an altar could tie a knight to years of danger. Crusaders took formal vows to journey to the Holy Land and fight there. Breaking that vow risked spiritual penalties, social shame, and legal complications at home. Sometimes, political deals ended local conflicts before those vows were fulfilled. Yet individuals still felt pressured to travel east, even when main campaigns had collapsed. Popes could commute vows into donations or service elsewhere, but not everyone got that option. Letters survive from men begging permission to redirect or delay their pledged journey. The rule turned personal piety into a long-term, high-risk travel contract. Honor meant honoring paperwork written in front of God, even when strategy changed. Knights sometimes needed papal permission to fight other Christian armies. Christian knights didn't just worry about enemy lances, they worried about church paperwork too. By the High Middle Ages, popes claimed authority over when Christians could fight Christians. Rulers sometimes sought papal approval before campaigns to avoid accusations of unjust war. Without it, they risked excommunication, interdicted lands, and awkward sermons about their souls. Papal letters could turn ordinary conflicts into semi-sanctioned holy causes with spiritual benefits. The same institution that preached peace also handed out blessings for certain wars. Knights listening to battlefield sermons heard both warnings and encouragement in the same breath. For soldiers, that meant moral lines shifting depending on which side had better letters. The rule mixed theology with politics until even drawing a sword felt bureaucratic. Samurai were expected to kill themselves if their lord died. For some retainers, loyalty to a lord literally didn't stop at the grave. The practice of junshi meant committing suicide after a beloved master's death. Retainers claimed they were following him into the next world as true companions. Shoguns and shogunate officials increasingly saw it as wasteful and politically destabilizing. Repeated bans tried to stop mass follow-the-leader suicides around high-ranking funerals. Still, some samurai defied the law, leaving farewell letters praising absolute devotion. Families could be split, with relatives begging loved ones not to honorably disappear. The practice turned grief into a public test of loyalty, measured in blood. Even in peacetime, a lord's final breath could trigger sudden ritual deaths around him. Warrior monks swore religious vows, yet charged battlefields with banners. In medieval Japan, some of the most feared armies wore robes instead of armor. Sohei, or warrior monks, came from powerful temples like Enryakuji and Kofukuji. They kept religious vows, chanted sutras, and then marched with naginata and bows. Temple estates controlled land, tolls, and politics, making them targets and power players. When disputes erupted, monks gathered under huge banners bearing sacred symbols and names. Armed processions into the capital could intimidate courtiers and rival clans alike. Sometimes rival temples even fought pitched battles, burning each other's buildings to the ground. It's a strange image, chanting warriors moving from altars straight to sieges. Their rules somehow combined non-attachment to worldly things with fiercely defended worldly property. Knights were required to fast before battles for spiritual readiness. Some knightly rules worried less about armor polish and more about breakfast menus. Religious teaching encouraged warriors to fast or confess before dangerous campaigns. The idea was to purify the soul in case death arrived suddenly. Commanders arranged masses, blessings, and processions on the eve of major engagements. A knight riding into battle might be hungry, absolved, and slightly lightheaded. Fasting made sense spiritually, but didn't exactly optimize energy for swinging steel. Yet refusing could look irreverent when everyone around you lined up at chapels. So soldiers balanced faith and fatigue, hoping holiness would make up for empty stomachs. Rules about food turned into one more layer of pressure before the trumpets sounded. Medieval codes allowed ransoming knights, but not paying peasant prisoners. The unwritten price list of war valued some lives in coin and others at zero. Knights captured in battle could expect negotiation, hostages, and maybe years of comfortable detention. Payment restored their freedom and let them eventually return to the same profession. Peasant infantry generally didn't come with families able to raise huge sums. Many were simply killed, mutilated, or marched away in chains as cheap labor. Chivalric literature focused on dramatic rescues of noble captives, not nameless archers. The rules turned social hierarchy into literal life-and-death math after each battle. You could march in the same army, yet occupy completely different afterlife options. Honor culture wrapped itself in crosses and banners, while quietly following the money. Samurai hair topknots were legally protected symbols of their status. For samurai, losing your hair could mean far more than a bad haircut. The chonmage topknot visually separated warriors from commoners in Edo period cities. Cutting it off as punishment effectively erased someone's public claim to samurai status. Authorities used forced haircutting alongside sword confiscation to mark criminals and troublemakers. During the Meiji reforms, officials encouraged men to abandon topknots for Western-style hair. For many samurai, that decree felt like stripping away centuries of inherited identity. Old portraits suddenly looked like relics from another planet's social system. Barbershops became quiet theaters where an entire class order changed with scissors. The rule around hairstyle showed how power can be rewritten, literally, at the scalp. Templar knights swore poverty while managing vast military bank accounts. No group combined "we're poor" and "we own half the map" quite like the Templars. Individual Templar knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like monks. As an order, though, they accumulated castles, farms, ships, and massive donations. Pilgrims stored valuables with them in Europe and withdrew credit in the Holy Land. Kings borrowed money from the same warriors they relied on for battlefield support. Templar strongholds doubled as secure vaults and early international banking branches. From the outside, the contrast looked suspicious, even hypocritical to rivals and debtors. Eventually, the French crown seized their assets and accused them of secret crimes. A rule meant to signal holy simplicity became ammunition for very worldly takedowns. Japanese sword laws. Let only samurai carry blades in public. Who could legally walk around armed in Japan depended heavily on class and era. Edicts like Hideyoshi's famous sword hunt forbade farmers from carrying weapons altogether. Swords became reserved symbols of the warrior estate, especially in the late 16th century. Later Tokugawa regulations tightened public weapon-carrying rules for commoners even more. In city streets, a daisho pair instantly announced someone as samurai or high status. Merchants and artisans might own blades, but were restricted in how they displayed them. Police patrols could confiscate weapons from those without proper standing or permission. The law literally drew a line of steel between people who ruled and people who paid. Authority wasn't just written in documents, it hung openly from certain belts. Knights needed ancestral proofs of nobility just to enter tournaments. Before some knights could joust, they basically had to pass a medieval background check. High-prestige tournaments sometimes required participants to show multiple generations of noble ancestry. Heralds examined coats of arms, family claims, and gossip about who really belonged. Men of recent wealth but shallow lineage could be politely turned away from lists. The rule protected older nobilities from being overshadowed by upstart armored rich guys. It also turned heraldry into a serious profession, not just pretty shield artwork. Disputes over who counted as gentle enough occasionally erupted into legal or physical feuds. In a culture obsessed with bloodlines, paperwork mattered almost as much as sword skill. Tournaments became stages not only for combat skill, but for genealogical bragging rights. Samurai could lose their swords as punishment, becoming ronin outcasts. For a samurai, the worst demotion wasn't a pay cut, it was losing steel. Authorities could strip a man of his swords for crimes or serious misconduct. Without a master and without weapons, he effectively dropped out of the samurai class. Such men became ronin, wandering warriors, often portrayed as desperate or dangerous drifters. Some ronin found new lords, others turned to teaching, guarding, or outright crime. Popular stories romanticized them as tragic figures swept aside by political change. But many were simply former mid-level bureaucrats who'd lost both job and sidearms. The punishment rule showed how identity, paycheck, and weapon license were tightly fused. Taking a man's blades away was like erasing his entire professional existence overnight. Some chivalric codes protected enemy churches, but not civilian houses. Even in brutal wars, knights sometimes carved out oddly specific don't touch zones. Chivalric and religious teachings urged respect for churches, relics, and certain holy sites. Burning a village might be acceptable. Burning its stone church could draw outrage. In theory, clergy and pilgrims enjoyed more protection than ordinary farmers and merchants. Yet those same rules were vague about barns, mills, and packed wooden neighborhoods. Armies still looted grain, animals, and anything else that kept campaigns supplied. Enemy civilians often hid valuables inside churches, hoping sanctity would discourage arson. Sometimes it worked. Other times, soldiers accidentally let sacred buildings catch fire anyway. The line between protected and expendable spaces depended heavily on stone walls and symbolism. Samurai were expected to announce their name before charging into battle. In many Japanese war tales, battles start with something like a roll call under arrows. Epic chronicles describe warriors riding out, loudly proclaiming their names and lineages. They wanted witnesses to know exactly who performed each reckless, heroic charge. Victory or death meant more if everyone remembered which house banner led it. Challenging an enemy by name also invited single combat instead of chaotic melee. It sounds suicidal, but reputation in that culture was worth huge future rewards. Songs and scrolls later immortalized those shouted introductions beside lists of great deeds. Quietly stabbing someone from behind carried less glory than loudly risking everything. The rule turned battlefields into live stages where warriors auditioned for historical memory. Knights could claim right of private war against personal enemies. In much of medieval Europe, nobles didn't always need royal permission to start fighting. The right of feud let lords wage private wars over insults or disputed rights. They gathered relatives, vassals, and mercenaries to raid castles and burn each other's lands. As long as certain customs were followed, it wasn't automatically considered criminal rebellion. Kings constantly tried to limit these conflicts with truce periods and legal alternatives. Still, noble honor culture treated restrained violence as a legitimate way to negotiate. Peasants, unlucky enough to live between feuding lords, paid the heaviest price. Their crops, homes, and even bodies became tools in someone else's family argument. Only when central states grew stronger did this personal war right finally shrink. Samurai could punish commoners harshly for disrespect on narrow bridges. On a crowded bridge in Edo, traffic etiquette could be terrifyingly one-sided. Social rules demanded commoners step aside and lower themselves when samurai approached. Failing to move quickly enough could be read as insolence or deliberate insult. A proud, stressed, or drunk samurai might put his hand to sword at once. Kirisute gomen culture meant the commoner's misstep could escalate to lethal correction. Even when no one died, being struck or humiliated carried little legal recourse. Urban legends spread about unlucky townsfolk whose only crime was blocking the way. Parents taught children strict passing rituals, especially in streets near castle districts. Here, a simple rule of yield the right of way came with mortal stakes. Knightly honor preferred fair fights over ambush, but ambush won wars. Chivalric stories love two mounted champions charging across an open, sunny field. Real commanders, however, knew surprise attacks and night marches usually worked better. Honor manuals praised courage, open challenge, and generous treatment of defeated opponents. Field marshals quietly planned river crossings at dawn and flank attacks through forests. Knights sometimes grumbled that such tactics felt sneaky or beneath their station. Yet kings judged them by results, not by how storybook the victory looked. Chronicles rarely gloss over how often ambushes decided campaigns and succession struggles. The gap between official ideals and battlefield practice could be embarrassingly wide. In the end, history remembers both glittering charges and the ambushes that made them possible. Knightly honor sometimes forbade shooting, first, even in obvious ambushes. Some rules told warriors to hold their fire until the enemy was fully ready. Honor demanded that both sides know they were in a fight before killing started. In duels, that meant waiting for a signal instead of sneaking an early shot. On battlefields, it could translate into letting enemy lines finish forming shields. Commanders balancing prestige and survival sometimes hesitated a moment too long. Accounts describe units standing under incoming arrows, waiting for orders to reply. To modernize, the restraint looks like madness. To them, it preserved reputation. Being labeled a coward or cheat could ruin a noble career despite victories. These rules turned even obvious ambush situations into moral puzzles with deadly consequences.